If the end of your set consistently looks like this, you may be missing out on about half of the muscle growth you could be getting. Soon to be Dr. Milo Wolf from Wolf Coaching here. Today, we're going to talk about how close to failure you should train to optimize your hypertrophy. I recently read a paper about training to failure for hypertrophy and for strength that actually changed a lot for me with regards to how I coach people and how I train myself for muscle growth. I actually made a meme about it and posted it on Instagram, and it got a lot of reaction. So I thought I'd make a longer video going into what I think about that paper, my thoughts are on training to failure versus training not to failure for hypertrophy, and kind of dissect that for you. For a long time, there were kind of two camps. There were the bros that trained to failure religiously, that said, unless you train to failure, you can't make it. You can think of fucking Mike Mentzer fanboys as an example. Equally, you had the evidence-based camp, which, based on the evidence and the best reviews at the time, thought that actually you could see pretty similar hypertrophy whether you're training to 3 reps shy of failure or to failure. So actually it didn't matter whether or not you went all the way to failure. Or at least it made a very, very small difference that you could easily make up by just doing a few more sets. And to be honest, I was kind of in the second camp, right? I'm relatively evidence-based, and I thought that, hey, if the evidence says that we can grow the same muscle training a few reps shy of failure versus training to failure, that's a good trade-off. However, that changed with the publication of a preprint by Zach Robinson and colleagues looking at the effects of how close to failure you train on hypertrophy and strength. So to summarize, what happened was, as a study had participants train closer and closer to failure, you saw more growth. So actually going from about 5 reps in reserve or 6 reps in reserve all the way to failure seemed to about double the magnitude of muscle growth. So on average, let's say training at 5 reps in reserve, you see about a 5% increase in muscle size from starting the program to the end of the program. When you train to failure, you might see about a 10% increase from the start of the program to the end of the program. So actually a pretty notable improvement. Now that's for hypertrophy, and importantly, failure is a bit complicated to define, right? So when you're talking about failure, ultimately it's extremely difficult or even impossible to tell whether or not failure actually occurred. You know, let's say you finish a hard set of squats. You do the last rep, it takes you a couple seconds, and you think, wow, I couldn't do another one. That's what we would call volitional failure. So that's ending a set when you think you can't do another rep. You think you're done, you think if you tried another rep, you'd fail. On the other hand, if now you're doing that same set, you were thinking the same thing, you went for that rep, you got it halfway up, you really grinded for like 3 full seconds, and it just wouldn't move, and it came back down, that's what we would call momentary failure. So essentially, you tried a rep and actually failed it, despite your best effort. It's worth noting that in practice, in the research, in practice as well, in your own training and in my own training, you can never truly know whether you hit failure. It's kind of impossible to know. You can only do your best, ultimately, but it is a limitation of research and of practice that you can never truly know whether or not you hit failure. You might think you gave it your best effort, but did you really? It's basically impossible to know. Here's what they found. Not only was there a relationship between how close to failure you trained, for example, training at 10 reps in reserve versus 5 versus failure, seemingly increased growth as you got closer and closer to failure, pretty linearly, but then actually there was something called non-linearity as you approached different degrees of failure, right? So from about 10 reps in reserve to what we call volitional failure, so ending a set when you think you can't do another one, there was a pretty linear growth and increase in hypertrophy as you went closer and closer to volitional failure. However, here's what the researchers did. They also distinguished between volitional failure and momentary failure. Momentary failure, when you try a rep and can't get it, is actually closer to true failure than volitional failure, because with volitional failure, you're ending a set when you think you can't do another one. But who knows, maybe if you tried, you'd have gotten it. So when they distinguished it that way, what they saw is that going from just volitional failure to all the way to actually failing a rep further increased muscle growth, but not just linearly, as it was doing before, but actually non-linearly. It increased muscle growth even more than you would expect if it was simply a linear relationship between how close to failure you train and hypertrophy. So actually, a very consistent and very notable improvement in hypertrophy the closer you get to true momentary failure, or in other words, actually failing a repetition. So that's really interesting. Here's a few quick limitations of this review paper. First, one thing it did well was that it actually looked at how close to failure you train as more of a continuous variable. Previous review papers had kind of dichotomized it into either you train to failure or you don't. But that's not very informative, because ultimately in practice, you don't not train to failure or train to failure. You might train with 2 reps in the tank, or 3 or 4 or 5, and those might have different effects on hypertrophy. And so with this type of review paper, what we really want to know is how does hypertrophy change at different intensities when we train at 2 reps in reserve versus 5 versus failure. And that's what this review did, and that was really cool. One strength and limitation of this paper though was that they included a lot of studies that didn't explicitly look at reps in reserve and hypertrophy, but rather they looked at different designs, like for example cluster sets, where people did sets of 2 with their 5 rep max, right? So a weight that they could maximally do for 5 reps if they give their best shot. And so we know that if they do sets of 2 as cluster sets with say 30 seconds rest, a set of 2, 30 seconds rest, a set of 2. We know that each of those sets would have 3 reps in reserve, and they also included those studies. Now, in some of these studies, estimating reps in reserve was pretty challenging, right? It's not always easy to, there's assumptions that go into it, so it may not be perfectly accurate, and that can generate a bit of variance or a bit more uncertainty about the exact size of the effect of going to failure versus having a rep in the tank or what have you. It's a bit more difficult to estimate, but it did add more data to their analysis, and thus, in my opinion, was a pretty solid analysis. Now, you might ask, okay, that's cool, but in these studies, they generally use like 1 exercise, or maybe 2, and they do maybe 5 or 10 sets a week. In practice, as someone who's read some literature, you might be like, cool, bro, I do 10 to 20 sets a week. So does that really apply to me? And here's the interesting thing. In this analysis, they performed other analyses too, and one of them was looking at how that relationship between reps in reserve and hypertrophy changed as more sets were performed. And actually, even when we're looking at higher number of sets, say 10 to 20 sets per week, that relationship of seeing more growth when training to failure versus training sub-maximally still existed, albeit to a lesser extent. So this shape of that curve for hypertrophy stayed the same, but the difference was just slightly lower. So if you're training with very high volumes, going from say training with 2 reps in the tank on average to training to failure is still going to make you see more growth, provided you can recover and everything else, but it will be a lower improvement compared to if you're doing say only 5 sets a week. Now, the $1 million question is why? Why does training closer to failure improve your hypertrophy? And to be honest, in my view, there's a few potential reasons. Number one, the kind of traditional you ambulance, shout out to ambulances, you feel me? The number one reason, and that's the reason they hypothesized in this paper, was something called motor unit recruitment. So essentially, your nervous system, it attaches to your muscle fibers, right? So the way you contract is your central nervous system sends out some signals to your muscle fibers and says, hey, we need to contract right now, we need to lift this weight. So we call the motor neurons, or essentially the cables, let's call them, the wires, and the muscle fibers they attach to, we call those motor units. And the amount of cables we fire electrical impulses through and signals to the muscle saying, hey, contract, 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 lift the weight, depends on how much force you need to produce, right? So if you're lifting your max, by definition, because it's your max, your central nervous system is going to recruit and send signals to all the motor units and all the muscle fibers available. However, depending on the weight you're lifting, not every rep is going to recruit every fiber. Let's say, for example, you do a set of 30 reps. On the first rep, it's a pretty easy rep. You're not fatigued, the weight you're lifting isn't very challenging, it's not very heavy, and so you may only recruit 20%, 30% of your muscle fibers to do that job. As you get closer and closer to failure though, some muscle fibers will fatigue. And so incrementally, your body will have to recruit more muscle fibers and different muscle fibers to accomplish that job of lifting that weight that was initially easy, but as fatigue set in, you have to recruit every single muscle fiber. And that's potentially a reason as to why going closer to failure recruits more muscle fibers. When you recruit a muscle fiber, they then produce tension, and by producing tension, you initiate hypertrophy. So when you're doing, say, a set of 10 with 5 reps in a tank, or 10 reps in a tank, some fibers in your muscle, they may not be getting recruited, they may not be getting used, they may not be producing tension, and tension eventually will stimulate hypertrophy. So by going to failure, you're making sure that every single muscle fiber is being recruited, is producing tension, and is then being stimulated for hypertrophy. And that might be the reason why going to failure, and even volitional failure, as opposed to momentary failure, the latter will produce more growth, is because the further you push, the more you're essentially ensuring that every single muscle fiber gets activated, recruited, and thus stimulated. That's the main mechanism that's been hypothesized for why going to failure is better for hypertrophy, substantially so actually, than not training to failure. Before we jump into practical applications and takeaways from this research and how I would approach your training now, let me make one thing clear. As I mentioned, the relationship between training to failure and hypertrophy did change, meaning it decreased as you did more sets. But I think one thing is worth keeping in mind. The most recent data we have on training volume and hypertrophy suggests that actually the effects of going from, say, 10 sets per week to 20 sets per week are about the same size as training, say, with 3 or 5 reps in reserve versus training to failure, or sometimes lower. So actually, in terms of importance, it's possible that training to failure produces more hypertrophy than, say, going from 10 sets a week to 20 sets a week. So in other words, pushing yourself from doing all your sets at 3 reps in reserve all the way to failure may produce more growth than going from, say, 10 sets a week to 20 sets per week. So the trade-off in fatigue may actually be more worthwhile training to failure versus not training to failure compared to doing 20 sets versus 10 sets. Even though both modifications, meaning going from 10 to 20 sets or training to failure versus not training to failure, will produce additional fatigue, the additional growth you get from that trade-off in fatigue may be superior when you train to failure versus doing more sets. It's not super clear yet, but that evidence does exist. Practical takeaways. A lot of bullshit about research, but what are the actual takeaways? Well, I think most of your training for hypertrophy should be pretty close to failure. How I would approach it, if you have sufficient time to train at your disposal, is to start your exercises. The first set should be about 2 reps in reserve. Then gradually, as you reach into set 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you gradually move closer to failure so that your last set, you either hit volitional failure. This is for exercises where you think failing isn't that safe. So I could think, for example, of squats or bench pressing without a spotter, or you can also go all the way for your last set to momentary failure. So this is for exercises like incline dumbbell pressing or dumbbell rows or pull downs, where failing is actually pretty safe. That's where I would go to all the way to momentary failure for that last set. This is where the interesting caveat comes in. The reason why I wouldn't take every set to failure necessarily, although you could, if you take the first few sets of a session to failure, the rest of your performance during that session will take a pretty big hit because you're fatigued, right? If there's anything to needing a certain workload overall, lifting this number of reps, this number of sets, this number of reps across a session to optimize hypertrophy, by going to failure on every set earlier in the session or earlier in an exercise, you may actually be shooting yourself in the foot a little bit as far as hypertrophy goes. So that's why I wouldn't necessarily take every set to failure. That being said, here's the second takeaway. I think that if you don't have enough time to train, training to failure is a very good idea for hypertrophy. So if you're someone who can only train twice a week for like half an hour or an hour each, probably every set you do should be very close to failure. There's other time-saving strategies like supersets, which I'll make a video on if you want. Leave a comment down below if you want to see that. Or like minimizing warm-ups. I can make a video about warm-ups if you want again. Leave a comment down below if you're interested. But going to failure for every set seems like a very time-efficient way to improve your hypertrophy. So if you can't train 7 days a week for an hour each, or even 5 days a week, or even 4 days a week, going to failure may be a very good strategy to increase your hypertrophy. Anyways, that's the video. If you like this video, please comment, like, subscribe, and all the other cringe shit every YouTuber ever says. But this isn't cringe, you feel me? Look at that. Anyways, see you guys on the next one. Peace.